Hello everyone and welcome to the Concrete Conundrum. So this is the fifth winter webinar and it's all about concrete. So what we've done is we've got the two most passionate people we know about concrete, and that's our very own Chris Kolonko and Steve Fisher, and they'll introduce themselves shortly. So we asked them one simple question. In an ideal world, what concrete archaeological site would you preserve and why? The idea was that they would then debate, but we actually went on a 3-hour tangent talking about why the sites don't get the same respect as other archaeological sites, what are the common pitfalls with recording this type of archaeology, and then just talking about how they got into it and how other people can get into it. So we don't come to a valid conclusion, but it is at least entertaining and informative. So hope you enjoy.
Right, yeah. Hello, my name's Chris Kolonko. I am the Citizen Team North's concrete botherer, and I spend most of my time indoctrinating colleagues in the way of concrete and annoying them with photos of concrete. Next step is world domination, concreting over the entire country, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Hello, my name's Stephen Fisher. I'm a freelance archaeologist and historian, and I do work with a number of heritage bodies. I've worked with a number of charities in the past, and I've worked on projects such as the restoration of LCT 7074, the last surviving D-Day landing craft in the country. And then a large amount of my work in various locations, including national parks like the New Forest, has in one way or another involved concrete, primarily looking at Second World War remains, which tend to primarily be made of concrete. And so I've developed a bit of a love, a passion for concrete, and I can now spot Second World War concrete at 200 yards quite easily and straight away bore whoever I'm with when I'm out in the countryside at that particular point in time and say, "Ooh, that looks Second World War," at which point they usually walk off.
So I've decided to go for the surviving pillboxes and other defences at Auburn Sands, which is a site just to the south of Bridlington, which sits in our Humberside discovery programme. This is a site that I've worked on with Citizen for many years. It was the first site that I worked on them with, and what's really cool about these surviving anti-invasion defences at Auburn Sands is that we have not just Second World War, but also First World War defences surviving on this section of the East Coast. And what makes this site even more important is that we still have a relatively complete set of coastal crust defences from both the First and Second World War. But it's an extremely rare example because a lot of the East Coast has been wiped out in the past 80 to 100 years through coastal erosion, which is a massive problem and one of the reasons why Citizen was set up. But this is a small kind of section of surviving defences that still survives relatively completely, which is a rarity for Yorkshire. And this is why I chose that site. And what's really even more cool is that we have pretty much the entire range of Second World War coastal crust anti-invasion defences represented in a relatively small stretch of coast as well. So we can see everything from anti-tank blocks, machine gun pillboxes, a second line of infantry pillboxes setting out this clear strategy in the landscape. What else we've got? We've got barbed wire, we've got Z1 scaffolding, we've got painted range markers inside the pillboxes, we've got surviving trenches which are still visible in the landscape, and you can clearly interpret them in relation to the pillboxes. So it's an amazing site, and I'll flag some photos up later that we can put in the video so you get an idea of what's going on there. But yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea of what I've chosen.
Well, first off, I'm very glad that Chris picked a sort of extensive site rather than just one individual pillbox, because I've also gone for a fairly extensive site. I did have a lot of trouble with the question, because in an ideal world, of course, we would be able to preserve absolutely everything. But at the end of the day, an ideal world isn't a real world, because although a lot of people see concrete as this permanent structure that will never decay, in reality it really will, especially Second World War concrete that's had reinforcement in it, rebar, because that will eventually rust as water starts to permeate the concrete. It will expand as a result, and it will shatter the concrete. So despite the fact that concrete looks as if it's going to be there for forever, eventually it will go. And I think Chris and I both have an interest in coastal Second World War sites, and they even more so. are at risk of erosion from coastal action, and there is really not much we can do to stop that. So ideally, I would be able to preserve these sites, but that sort of world isn't just in terms of changing public opinion or slapping some legislation on a site to stop a developer from building on it. What we were talking about here is preventing the tide, which we know we cannot do, as King Canute found out as well, or as he proved rather, because of course he was there to prove that he can't control the tides to his courtiers. But that said, if I was to pick a site that I consider to be one of the most important Second World War sites, and that I would do my very level best to try and preserve, it was very difficult because there are so many types of structure that have different functions, and from all periods of the war. There's airfields, there's training areas, there's bombing ranges, there's bunkers, there's air raid shelters, there's pillboxes. But I have rather predictably, because as anyone who has seen my work before will know, I have a great interest in D-Day and the relics of D-Day on the south coast. So I've gone for what is excitingly titled Embarkation Area B2, which is more than just an embarkation hard. It's the entire structure and organization behind that embarkation hard. So it includes the embarkation hard itself, where landing craft would come up to the coast and embark their troops. But it also includes the road network that leads inland from there, and all of the associated improvements that were made to that particular area to handle the volume of traffic that would be passing through it. So what this also includes is a bridge across a small river that was widened to take more traffic, and includes concrete alongside the original brick construction of the bridge. The roads themselves, which had to be relaid in concrete to take the weight of all of the vehicles that would be passing over them, and laybys, passing places that were built into the road network so that if a vehicle broke down, it could be pulled off of the road and wouldn't block that access for convoys, or if by some accident, because they weren't supposed to do this, a vehicle went the wrong way down a road and meets a convoy coming the other way, it could easily pull in, get out of the way and let the convoy go past. So there's this whole site beyond the immediate structure that people tend to see when they visit this embarkation hard, which is at Leap Country Park in the New Forest. People go and they look at the embarkation hard and they say, oh, this is where people left D-Day. And they don't see the huge amount of infrastructure for a mile inland behind it. And the only way that you perceive that as one individual site is on the administrative maps that were issued just before D-Day to army commanders, where it is fully described and labelled, and that area is pecked off with a little marker pen, calling it Embarkation Area B2. So I've gone for that one because there's so much concrete in it and so many different sites, and because of the story that it tells.
I do like the fact that you've both been quite pragmatic and picked two sites that have loads of different examples and kind of show World War II and World War One and everything else. Well, World War Two. So firstly, how long does concrete last? Does anyone actually, because obviously Chris's ones there, pillboxes weren't meant to be permanent, were they?
No. So yeah, I don't think we really know how long these things were meant to last. They were meant to last for the duration of the war, which is kind of like an open-ended time period. But what we're seeing more recently now is, as Steve mentioned earlier, is that I think we're starting to get to the end of the natural lifespan of many of these structures now, because the rebar is starting to fail, especially in coastal areas where it gets you get a mixture of kind of three. Kind of mixture of things taking place, including tidal scour, wave action. You also get freeze thaw, which I can never say, and then the natural degradation of both the concrete and its internal rebar. And it's kind of in the last 10, 15 years that I've started to notice that these things are starting to naturally decay, and I think getting close to the end of the natural life of many of these structures, especially when they've not been maintained for the past 80 to 100 years, in terms of both First and Second World War stuff. So yeah, my answer to that would be, I think we're 80 to 90 years is kind of like the natural lifespan of something like this, if it's not being maintained on a regular basis.
What would you say would be more important to preserve, the defensive nature of of the war or the offensive nature of the war? The actual attack or the defense? Which one do you feel is more important to have a record of?
Well, I think Chris and I have both played to our own strengths, obviously. I'm gonna pitch for the offensive side, obviously, because I chose it. But also, I think what's important about the site I've chosen is that it was actually used for its prescribed function. Now, whilst the defensive site did serve that vital role, especially in 1940, 41, and even into 1942, they were never tested and they were never actually used. Now, that is a good thing. And in a way, they were used in the sense that they discouraged, or they contributed towards the discouragement of any attempted invasion by the enemy in those early years of the Second World War. But what's crucially important about the sites I've chosen is that they were actually used for their prescribed purpose. And people tend to think of D-Day as being over on the French coast, and D-Day commences the moment the first landing craft touches the beach. But really, it starts over in this country when the order was given to start embarkation at the very end of May 1944. And then all of these sites come to life, and they played the part that they were designed for. And in fact, they'd been built 2 years previously, but they played their part just as intended and were actually used for D-Day. And with no disrespect to your sites, Chris, but that they weren't actually used in the manner in which they were intended to be used. And that's a good thing. But that's why my sites are far more important.
See, I want to agree with that. That's this is the thing. What I like about Steve's sites is you're seeing the kind of the pinnacle of organisation in this country during the Second World War. So we're seeing this culmination of the organisation of logistics, planning for landing troops in France again. And this has all been all represented in the road networks associated with the embarkation hards, like Steve says. And it's that which I think is really important. It's kind of like the polar opposite of what we see with the sites that I, investigate more frequently. So yeah, I really do like that, but it is hard for me to argue that the stuff that I'm interested in shouldn't be preserved. Because what I like with like Steve says, I essentially specialise in battlefields that never were, which were planned to the minutest detail, but were never thankfully used or never needed to be used. But I don't know, it's kind of hard because what I specialise in is more an active defence rather than a passive defence. And I think that what we can still learn from these active defences that were constructed in 1940 means they're exceptionally important, because there's still so much we don't know about these. Everyone seems to know about Dad's Army, the Home Guard and all this stuff, but the Home Guard were a relatively minuscule part of a much wider defensive network, which consisted of the regular army, the territorial forces, the Air Force, the auxiliary units, the Royal Observer Corps, anti-aircraft batteries, and all this stuff. So I think, from my perspective, the anti-invasion defences are much more important, because if they didn't still survive, we wouldn't be able to investigate them further and look at how they developed over the period from 1940 to the end of 1942, how new weapon systems were introduced, and how, most importantly, they were sat into the landscape. Often people see a pillbox and go, "Oh, it's isolated and it's rubbish," and the Germans would have walked through it. That's the voice of someone who says that kind of thing. But in reality, when we start to look at these things not in isolation as a single structure, but as part of a wider defensive landscape, that's when their group value is realized. And then when we start to do the documentary research using aerial photographs and war diaries and command files, it's then that we start to see this importance. And I think the anti-invasion defences are much more worthy of preservation for this fact that if they went tomorrow, we would have lost, although a relatively short period of history, we'd have lost the understanding of this vitally important period in terms of the fact that we could no longer study them, and we wouldn't be able to answer these questions that we still have, only 80 years later.
Again, in terms of actual protection currently, how many is there protected pillboxes? Ignore the email. Is there protected? pillboxes at the moment?
There are, but it's like everything else. There are very it's a case of people. Well, firstly, it's a case of the structure itself meeting the required criteria for listing and scheduling, which a lot of people don't realise that there are set criteria, and if a lot of pillboxes don't meet this criteria, and also you've got on top of that as well the significance isn't often realised because very few people do documentary research to show the significance of these structures. But yeah, there are examples which are listed, but they're relatively few if when you consider how many survive, which is something like, I don't know, when the Defence of Britain project finished in 2002, I think they recorded something like 18,000 pillboxes or something like that, which is probably going to be a lot less now. It's nearly 20 years since that project finished. But yeah, out of that, there's a, I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like less than 50 are actually listed or scheduled. So there are examples, but they're very few, and there's a lot of work needed to be done to identify and apply for listing for structures that meet the criteria and are significant examples and survivors.
How many of the embarkation huts? Well, firstly, how many was there to begin with? And then how many of them are preserved?
In terms of the numbers that were constructed, I think the total number I've come up with now is 76 or 78. I can't remember off the top of my head. There were 6 in Wales, 3 in Scotland, and then the rest were in England, primarily along the south coast, so between Falmouth and round to Deal, with a couple in the Thames estuary area around Medway, and then a couple a little bit further north up towards Felixstowe. But in the main, you're looking at concentrations around the major ports of Falmouth, Plymouth, Weymouth and Portland, Poole, the Solent, where most of them are, of course, and then all of the smaller ports along the south coast until you get to Dover, where there was another cluster, and then more elsewhere. So yeah, of those 76 or 78, only a few have been removed in their entirety. So at places like Hive near Folkestone, there were 3 embarkation hulls there, and they've gone completely. I can't see any physical trace of them anymore. And the very last bits of them, which were concrete approach roads, appear to have gone, unfortunately, in the last couple of years. But in the main, they all leave some evidence. So it's either the approach roads or the concrete apron, the large hard standing area that sat above the high water mark, or the very famous enigmatic chocolate blocks, the beach hardening maps that were prefabricated and then laid in sections across the beach area, and which survive today. Then they're the most sort of visible remains of these embarkation hulls, the most visible evidence that there is something different there that has a different purpose compared to the other bits of just flat concrete. In terms of how many are protected, 2. They're both in Devon, one at Brixham and the other just north at Torquay. But what's very interesting about those is that it is literally just the bit on the coast that is protected. So they have scheduled the immediate area of the beach hardening mats and the concrete apron. Then immediately behind that, in the case of Brixham, you have a specially constructed concrete approach road, and you have an area where a house was demolished to create a turning circle for transport so that they could access that embarkation area. And today it's a bus stop. It's actually a turning area for buses to pull in, turn around and head back out in the direction they're coming in. And they're not recognised. They're not part of the scheduling. Most people don't even realise that they are part of the site because there's no information to support that. If you go onto the listing pages, those bits aren't mentioned, even though they are literally adjoining that embarkation hub. And it's the infrastructure behind the hards that is less well recognised, and it's not really recorded in historic environment records, unless I've added it. And most of the hards themselves, I'd say about 70% are on historic environment records, but many of those date back to the not the Defence of Britain project, it was the 20th century fortifications in England project, carried out primarily by Colin Dobinson, and he did fantastic work going through the archives and then providing that data to Historic England. But because he was working pre-internet and he didn't have the facility to visit all of these sites or accurate grid reference translation software from military grid used in the 1940s to modern day grid references, many of his locations are off by as much in some cases as 300 or 400 meters. And that doesn't sound like much, but when you're dealing with a harbour or a waterside area, that's the difference between one wharf or quay or slipway and another. And so quite a few of those locations I've noticed are in the wrong place. And the HER record, the historic environment record, is actually for the wrong slipway.
Would you say that's one of the problems, that often they protect one area of something that has such a massive context that it's so difficult to visualize? I found that always with D-Day. It's so difficult to visualize when you're looking at one bit. Would you say that's one of the problems that you have with preservation of this stuff, is that people do not understand the context behind it? They just look at a pillbox or anti-invasion things, just go, oh, it's an isolated thing, it doesn't connect, it doesn't. And the same with embarkation hards, they just see a concrete apron, say a flat piece of concrete, and just like, oh, it's just a concrete car park, essentially. Do you think that is one of the problems, that it's so hard to get the context across?
Yeah,
Yes.
very much so. You know, I think if you go on Facebook, most public engagement with, you know, what I do, pillboxes and stuff, is literally people just posting a photo of a pillbox and going, it's a Type 22, and then that's it. You know, and people go, oh, nice box and all this stuff. It's just like, no, look at the wider context. You know, you can, or if you are going to look at a single structure, look at how it's built, look at the, you know, immediate area and all this stuff. And yeah, I think unfortunately, yeah, the wider context is often lost on a lot of people. You know, it's similar on Twitter as well. I get sent photos of pillboxes fairly often, which is really nice. But it doesn't really tell me anything about this. You know, I can look at it and go, yep, pillbox. But unfortunately, you know, without this wider context and the wider landscape and maybe even a map, I don't really learn anything from this type of stuff. So yeah, the wider context of these sites is massively underrated. And even if you do something as simple as, you know, get an ordnance survey map and plot the points on a map, which is how I got started in the early 2000s, you start to see these patterns emerging. And it's not until you do that you start to realize the importance of, you know, this single structure in the wider landscape, which is, I'm sure, something Steve sees with the embarkation hards on the south coast as well.
Yeah, I think it's true of all Second World War sites that it's sometimes very difficult to communicate the whole rather than just the individual bit, and it's certainly true of pillboxes. I would say the one site where it's a lot easier for Second World War locations is airfields, because it's much easier to show people the concrete building bases of Nissen huts and other types of huts for accommodation areas and structures all around the airfield, the administrative areas, the bomb stores, the control tower, and that sort of thing. And in many instances, these purely survive just as the concrete building base. But even so, you can still connect that to the much larger structure, which is the runways. And people understand that. They see that an airfield was many individual bits, that bomb stores had to be separate from accommodation and that sort of thing. And when you tell people this was the accommodation area for the airfield, they understand, and it's very easy. With embarkation hards, it's much harder to communicate why they are where they are and that sort of thing. They need to be connected to existing inland infrastructure. So there's no point having an embarkation hard if you don't have a road that leads to it. And at Leap, for instance, which was built in a very isolated area for the very simple purpose that they didn't want people to see it, it needed a brand new road to be built to it. And so you have this very long, mile-long concrete road, which is preserved in absolutely brilliant condition, which isn't appreciated for what it is. People just see a concrete track, and you get those everywhere. But actually, a lot of the concrete roads we have along the south coast are from these D-Day preparations. But also on the other side of that, on the maritime side, that embarkation hard has to be approachable from the sea as well, and so it has to fit within a broader organizational perspective of being able to get ships to it, but also having space to get numerous ships to it. So at Stokes Bay in Gosport, for instance, you have 4 embarkation hards side by side, purely so that you can do mass loading. So one huge military unit can come down to the beach and embark in one mass maritime unit all at the same time. And it can be sometimes difficult. At Stokes Bay, it's much easier to see those 4 sites and see that they all serve the same purpose and they are all therefore connected. But at more isolated locations, it can be a lot trickier to get people to connect the roads that were built inland and the passing places and the reinforced bridges with the embarkation hub, even though they share such an obvious sort of common goal, if you like, of being able to move massive amounts of men and vehicles. So yeah, it's difficult. Airfields, I think, are the real exception. But anywhere else, it can be very hard to perceive that larger site, which is one of the reasons I chose a site for this, because I wanted to talk about the entire structure, not just the one individual bit.
Yeah, it's always scale. I really struggle with scale, despite knowing a bit more than most. Still, really struggle to understand the scale of stuff we're talking about. Okay, so back to your individual sites. If someone went down to your individual sites, what would they see? What is it? Before we go into very specific terminology, what would they see? What is it? And how do you actually tell it apart? Like, how did you work out different bits, if that makes sense? How do you actually tell this stuff apart from other things? And like, I imagine a lot of documentary research goes into it, but how did you identify certain bits that went to it, contributed to its importance? That makes sense.
Good question. Well, let's start with what it is. So yeah, what I've chosen, as I explained earlier, is a relatively short stretch of beach, but what it consists of is a series or a double row of these massive anti-tank blocks above the high water mark of the beach, just below a dunescape, as we'll see in the photo. And this is effectively covered by a single machine gun pillbox. And what really drew my attention, because these things, this site is pretty obvious in the landscape. I didn't just walk along the beach and go, oh, it's a pillbox and anti-tank cubes, and everyone was like, oh my god, I'd never seen those before. But what was really cool about these is, if you go elsewhere on the Yorkshire coast, in particular the East Yorkshire coast, which consists of large stretches of beach backed by boulder clay cliffs, which erodes at something like 1 metre to 2 metres a year. If you go elsewhere on the Yorkshire coast, you don't see this setup. You'll see like the odd pillbox in the landscape and the odd tumbled anti-tank cube, but you'll never see the two in their original format together, with the pillbox overlooking the beach and the anti-tank cubes as well. So that's very rare to see. So what really drew my attention to this is the fact, like I say, that you've got this machine gun pillbox with this specific function, these anti-tank cubes with a very specific function, and most importantly as well, behind that, you've got an anti-tank wall. And this was the point where, when I first visited the site with Andy and Meg back in 2015, it was this thing, that was what drew my attention to it, was the fact that you had this anti-tank wall, and then they'd gone and built anti-tank cubes in front of that. And that got me thinking, okay, right, so why would you build an anti-tank wall, then anti-tank cubes? What's going on here, And when we started to look at the actual fabric of the concrete, you could see that this anti-tank wall, when you go onto the site, is constructed from this massively sandy concrete, really nasty stuff. You can, I don't recommend this, but rub it and the sand actually comes off. It is really cheap and nasty. And then you compare that to the concrete of the anti-tank cubes. Again, I've got some photos which we can stick up on screen in a second. You'll see this difference in concrete. And like I say, that got me thinking about phasing of these structures. So clearly the anti-tank wall came first. This is something you do with stratigraphy, where one layer seals another. And it's something that's never really applied to Second World War construction and concrete. And it was, like I say, this got me thinking about the fact that this particular example saw at least 2 phases of construction. And it wasn't until much later, when I got my hands on the Dobinson reports, which were done in the 90s, that he highlighted the documentary record clearly shows that there were 2 phases of construction on this site, with the second phase taking place in, well, first phase was, what was it, June to August 1940, and then the second phase was March time 1941, give or take. And it was just that there was like, oh, this is amazing. We can clearly see these 2 phases of defence construction going on in the landscape. And it was just like, that is something that's often overlooked. People generally think that the anti-invasion defences were built and that was it. There was a massive amount of modification and additional defence construction go on post 1940. Many sites were modified to incorporate new weapon systems as they were introduced in 1941, such as the Blacker Bombard or the Spigot Mortar. And like I say, what I really like about the Auburn Sand site is that you see this this continuity and change as well, all the way from the First World War all the way through to the Second World War. And again, when you look at the site in further detail, I've got another picture which I'll send through as well for to kind of demonstrate what I'm going. And I've lost it now. Where's it gone? Where are
Giving
you?
me a longer editing job again.
Yeah, here we go. So there was, yeah, when I looked at the anti-tank wall with Andy and Meg, we noticed these wooden
What does
pegs
an
sat in.
anti-tank wall look like? Like what?
It's a big
How,
concrete wall.
was it just the position of it that made you call it an anti-tank? Is an anti-tank wall? Was it just the position you went, that's an anti-tank wall, or is it like 5 foot thick, or what are we talking?
It's there's no real standard specification for an anti-tank wall, but it is literally just a wall made of concrete, and the idea is that a tank tries to come over it and it exposes its underbelly. It's literally just a wall to impede the movement of a tank, and there's no other reason for you to build a massive wall at the base of a small cliff, other than to impede the movement of vehicles. But they're quite well. They were relatively common, during the 1940s. But yeah, when we looked at this in more, we started to look at it. We noticed these wooden pegs. Quite a simple thing that you'd easily overlook. And again, this was, looking at the documents in the 1940s, the way that the defences were constructed is that someone would come along and plot out and peg out the line of where they would want something. So, for example, this anti-tank wall was pegged out with these wooden pegs in the ground and possibly tape. And then the people building the defences came along and cast the anti-tank wall around these wooden pegs. And as a result of that, these wooden pegs survive within the anti-tank wall. So we've got not only the 2 phases of defence construction, we've also got the pre-construction phase represented in this site as well, which I've never seen anywhere else, which is really, really cool. But yeah, when you start to look at the Auburn Sands pillboxes, you just see more and more things. You notice something every time you're out there. You could just go on forever recording these things, but these are, when you look at the standard records or the records that we have on our database, a lot of the records we have is literally just like, it'll say one sentence of World War II pillbox, and that's it. And then when you go and actually look at these things, you can write, you can do a full building survey on a single pillbox, which gets the detail in there, which is required. But yeah, it's the amount you could spend a lot of time there just looking for these minute details, which tell you a lot about construction techniques and all this stuff.
So if you were to visit Leap, you would probably go by car because it's fairly isolated. You could catch the National Park Authority's hop-on bus, which runs through the summer, and that will take you down to Leap. And you'll drive down Leap Road, which goes from the small village of Langley down to the very coast. And you'll come across a little rise, and then ahead of you is the sea, and you get very excited. And then you go into the car park at the top of the cliff. And what you don't realise is you've already gone fully into this embarkation area, and you've already driven down nearly a mile of concrete road, which had passing places on it, and the concrete is still there, perfectly preserved. It's been tarmacked over with a very thin layer of tarmac, but when it rains and it washes away the sides of this road on the earth banks, you can actually see the concrete still underneath. So you're actually already in the heart of this place, even if you don't necessarily realize it. Now, you might, perhaps after you've parked your car, walk over to the cliff to look over to the sea, and you'll find little bits of concrete along the the tops of the cliffs. That's the remains of a coastal battery that was built, an emergency coastal battery from 1940. I'm not including that in my chosen site because it's a different period. It wasn't necessary to the functions of this of the embarkation area. And then you will probably follow one of the little recommended walks along the beach, and that will take you east for about 1 kilometre to Stone Point, or now it's known as Stanswood Point. The names have moved, as they tend to do on coastal locations. And then you'll come to this very large concrete platform. And all it is just a concrete platform. It looks like a car park, like you said earlier, Grant. And if it's at low tide, you'll look out to sea and you'll see this field of the chocolate blocks, the beach hardening mats that have been laid in the intertidal area. And then just beyond those, you'll see two dolphins, which were mooring positions for the landing craft coming in. They're made of metal and wood, so I can't really include them in this either because they're the wrong material, but they are an integral part of the embarkation hub necessary for the landing craft to come in. And that's all it really is. It's a very simple structure, because what was needed for these sites to work and for landing crafts to work was a concrete beach. The very idea of a landing craft is it deposits troops and vehicles onto a beach, and so all of the entry and egress from this landing craft is through the bow ramp. The bow just falls flat onto the ground and troops can march on. And that doesn't really work in existing docks, which have cranes and high wharf side walls. So what was needed was a beach where vehicles could just drive on and off of landing craft, and in order to make that as practical as possible, just concrete it so that you don't get bogged down in sand or shingle, and so that the landing craft can easily pull away from it as well without getting stuck on a bit of the shore. So they're very simple structures. If it wasn't for the dolphins, they would be almost completely 2D, because you just walk across them and then you leave. There's no upstanding bits, although there were often huts built behind them for the hardmaster and for the Royal Navy crew that were working it. So you will find the building platforms for those, but the Nissen hut or the timber huts have long since been removed. Next to this, in Leap in particular, you will find a massive brick and concrete structure which was used for the construction of Mulberry Harbour Phoenix caissons. I'm not including that in this either, because that was for a separate function. I'm really only interested in the embarkation area. You'll look at it and you'll think, oh, there's not much here, and then you'll walk back to your car, you'll get an ice cream, you'll do all the things that you do at Leap Beach, and then you might say, I want to go to Exbury House and look at the gardens. And then for another 2 miles, you will drive down concrete roads, again, without even realizing it, because they've just been, a very thin layer of tarmac has been laid over them. But underneath, the base foundations of that road is a Second World War structure built to make it easier for vehicles and convoys to reach these embarkation hearts. And once you have seen quite a few of these, like I have, because I'm very sad, you start to recognize them because of the simplicity of their design, but also because of the enigmatic chocolate blocks, which are instantly recognizable. And really, although they were used for other purposes around the country, they were primarily used for these embarkation hubs. And most of the ones I've located, almost all of them, have been through documentary research. And Colin Dobinson's work was a brilliant starting point. But what was very it was a limiting factor of his work was that he was only interested in the embarkation hard itself. But what's fascinating is that the records he used were the road construction records. So he was looking at records that detailed the building of the roads, but all he did was record the hards, which were at the very end of them. And having gone back through the records that he consulted to get all of these locations, I've been uncovering more evidence of the road building. And this is what's helped me identify, as I call them, D-Day laybys, the passing places that were built on the sides of the roads, the reinforced bridges, the other access roads and communication routes into the embarkation huts. Not all of those were actually mapped. Not all of them have been thoroughly recorded, because a lot of time the work was just done on spec as it was needed, and there wasn't the associated paperwork and back and forth literature that was necessary for the construction of so many sites. And so once you get your eye in and you start to see a lay-by in an interesting place, and you look at the tarmac and you realize that it's cracked where the underlying concrete segments, if you like, have gaps between them, and that's caused the tarmac to split over time, you really start to get your eye in and you start to see these features all around the landscape. And half of the sites at Leap in that road network aren't actually recorded in any of the paperwork I've consulted. They're sites that I've identified as being part of the same period of construction. And although there's no documentary evidence to back that up, because it doesn't seem to have been filed or kept, there is no question in my mind that these other sites I've identified are all part of that larger construction and improvement of that area for the embarkation of troops for D-Day. So it's a mix of using the documentary evidence and then using that evidence to then interpret other sites and see the same details in those locations as well.
Yeah, interesting. Because I think chocolate blocks is one of those ones. Once you know what they are, you start seeing them everywhere. You've kind of walked over them your whole of your life, and then once you know what they are, a bit like anti-tank cubes do the same, if that makes sense. Once you know what they are, suddenly they appear everywhere. You've dismissed them in the past, and then suddenly once you know, because of you two, sadly, I used to never notice this stuff. Once it's been told to you, suddenly you see it everywhere. Suddenly you're just walking along and you realize it's embarkation hard. Usually I text one of you two and you tell me, oh, you stood on top of this and this. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. Hello, all, sorry for the interruption. We went on a rather large 45-minute tangent here. Notice it goes from light to dark. So I cut it, basically. If you want to see it, let us know, but back to it. But what would you record and how?
Good question. Yeah, I'm not sure how much of this stuff is going to survive, which is, why it's really important to record it while it's still around. And in my experience now, I think it's even more important given that, like we said earlier, we're getting to the kind of end of the natural lifespan of concrete as a building material now, and we're also seeing obviously the need for more housing, increased coastal erosion. So, the time really is now to get recording. It's something that should have really been ongoing since the Defence of Britain project ended 20 years ago. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases hasn't. So obviously, probably the easiest way you can record Second World War stuff is to use the Citizen Recording app, which we've got, which has recently been updated to make it a lot simpler to use. So that'll give you a good idea of the type of information that we require, such as location, photographs, and all that. But for example, if you're recording a Second World War pillbox, for example, there's a set number of things that I like to record when I'm doing it. I wrote a blog about this, which you'll find on the Citizen website called something like what we can learn from pillboxes or something like that, which has a recording form that I did in there. So generally, when you're looking at a pillbox, things you need to record are shaping plan, which is really, really important. You look at a lot of records we have for pillboxes, and they don't even do the basics of saying this pillbox is square in plan or anything like that. Next thing you want to look at is wall thickness. So it might seem like a minute detail, but it's really, really important for us. So when pillboxes were constructed during the Second World War, they were built to two specifications. The first of these was bulletproof, which, as the name suggests, the thickness of the reinforced concrete would be proof against a bullet-sized projectile. That was 38 centimeters thick. And the second spec was shell-proof, which would be proof against relatively small 37 millimeter shot, which was standard for tanks at the time when these things were constructed. And these were relatively thick reinforced concrete walls of about 1 meter 6 centimeters in thickness. So when these things were constructed, the Royal Engineers would actually record whether the pillbox was bulletproof or shellproof when they were creating the lists of the number of pillboxes they were constructed. So this is an aspect of the anti-invasion defences that is completely forgotten a lot of the time because people think records weren't kept, when in reality Dobinson made this really clear in his reports. They were counting pretty much every single brick, every ton of concrete that was used, and they were reporting this back on a weekly basis up the chain of command, so they knew how many resources were being consumed, which was really important to ensure you didn't run out of the resources you were using to construct the anti-invasion defences. So that's another important thing to record. Basic things like the orientation, so which way the pillbox faces. We don't, the vast majority of pillboxes, we don't know which way they were facing, so we don't know what they in the landscape they were covering. So if this thing bounces off a cliff and gets destroyed or shifts because of coastal erosion, we don't know its original orientation. And this is why it's really important. Tying into that as well are the number of embrasures. So the number of embrasures and their orientations as well, so that we know where the pillbox could fire. From that information, then using basic analysis, we can start to, if the pillbox is lost, we can at least plot or get an idea of what the primary arc of fire was, but also where the pillbox could potentially cover in the landscape as well. And it's just a simple case of going, right, this embrasure faces north, this one faces east, this one faces west, etc., etc. Anything else? Construction technique. So you generally see pillboxes constructed from using wooden shuttering, in my area anyway, where they would build a wooden frame and pour the concrete into that. But we also get brick shuttering as well. And this gives the impression that pillboxes are constructed from brick, when in reality, this is just an outer surface of brick into which concrete was poured. So if you can identify the methods of construction that we used, any phases of construction, any quirks in the design of the pillbox, such as what Peter Hibbs recorded last year. There's a pillbox that he recorded in East Sussex that was built near a tree, and because it was built near this tree, which was part of its camouflage scheme, they actually moved the wall slightly, which created this weird shape, and that had never been noticed before. But it's a matter of, yeah, just actually taking a look at these structures, identifying anything that you think might be interesting or needs to be recorded, but also recording these standard bits of information which I outline in the blog online. But the most important thing in terms of recording that I can put forward is to spend the time to look at the structure you are recording, rather than just rocking up, taking a photo, going, it's a World War II pillbox, and that's it. You know, you can spend, if you spend 15 minutes, half an hour just to take a look around the structure where possible and where it's safe, that tells us a lot more than just rocking up and going, yeah, it's a pillbox, it's from World War II, it's on a beach, the end. You know, there's, yeah, and this doing so as well obviously helps us to build up a better idea of how unique every single pillbox constructed was as well. And also as well, start to think about how the pillbox relates to the landscape itself, keep an eye out for any other defences in the area, and try to work out how these things relate to each other. This is the important thing, is to actually analyse and think and try to work out and answer some basic questions, such as why was the pillbox located where it is? You know, has anything been lost? Is it in good condition? Was it modified? You know, just think about this stuff and take the time to look at it. That's you know, that's the important thing, because you'll be surprised how many things you realise you missed. You know, when you go back to look at something, you go like, oh right, I didn't see that footprint in the roof, or I didn't see that someone had chipped the name onto the interior. You know, there's so much, and there's so much that remains to be recorded today.
Chris's approach is absolutely right, and getting as much detail as possible is really important, because you think that this sort of stuff is all recorded in records from the time, and a lot of the time it really isn't. But from my own experience, a lot of the sites I've worked on are too big to do that. And in particular, I'm thinking of airfields in the New Forest, and I've spent hours walking around Beaulieu Airfield recording sites with volunteers and with other colleagues, and I've also spent hours processing that data as well. And in sites of the scale that we see at an airfield, which have 200 individual elements, individual building bases, sockets for lamps alongside the runways. In fact, it's more like, actually off the top of my head, the rough number of records we compiled for individual features of Beaulieu Airfield was closer to 600, actually. When you have a site of that scale, you really have to take a much more general overview approach. And one of the ways in which we worked with volunteers is to map all of these sites as best as we can before we go out and do survey, using remote sensing and GIS. So we can use LiDAR data, which creates a nice topographical map, which will show up building bases because they have a different surface pattern to the surrounding undergrowth. And also historic photographs and other records such as that, to map all of these features in GIS. And GIS sounds quite scary to a lot of people, but really it is just a way of annotating maps to your own benefit. So you can draw on a map anything that you want and record individual things like your house, your garden, your nearest shop, Or in archaeology, we use it to map features. We can map barrows and see the relationship of barrows along a ridge overlooking Stonehenge, for example. Or we can use it to map individual pillboxes. Or in the case of an airfield, we can use it to draw the outline of building bases or runways, or identify lamp sockets, and then go out with volunteers or as many people as want to come along and actually look at these locations, find them, using it's very simple technology. You can use our mobile phone now to put that GIS map that we've created into Google Maps, and then use our phone and the little dot that appears on Google Maps to walk to it and find it. Then we can check it, make sure it is what we think it is, record it in sufficient detail. Because these are all two-dimensional objects, all we really need to do is measure the length and the width. If it was one individual site, we might be interested in excavating to see how deep the concrete is, whether there's any shuttering, anything like that. But when we're looking at 600 individual locations, that's just not feasible. So we'll photograph it, record it, say, is this as we anticipated it to be from the remote sensing and digital archives that we looked at? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. How do we need to change it? And then process all of that data back in the office again using GIS to create a digital map of the entire feature. And you can go into the New Forest Knowledge website and you can see the maps that have been created through the New Forest Remembers World War II project of all of the individual elements of Bewley Airfield or Holmesley South Airfield, showing all of the individual building bases, the bomb stores, the lamps, and all of that kind of detail. And we can do that because it's such a two-dimensional site. And I would use the same approach for an embarkation hard. Now, previously, the embarkation hard was in fact surveyed in 1990 by Carenza Lewis from Royal Historical Commission on Ancient Monuments and Martin Hughes from Hampshire County Council, and they used the old tape survey method, which has created an absolutely brilliant baseline survey of the embarkation hard. Now, having got all of those measurements, we don't need to do it again because it's not moving, it's not changing. The concrete isn't expanding more than weathering is causing. So we know the baseline dimensions of the site. So really it's a case of monitoring and preserving the records that we have. We can, though, use more modern technology where it's available to capture an entire site, because an embarkation hard is very large. It's the size of a car park, essentially. But it's very simple in terms of its structure. So there's no point doing minute drawn surveys of individual concrete slabs or anything like that. It's not necessary. But we can use more modern technology, like drones, to create more up-to-date and more interactive records. And in fact, at LEAP, I've worked with a friend of mine, Felix Pedrotti, and we flew a drone survey over the embarkation hard. And Felix was then able to use all of the photographs that the drone took to create a three-dimensional model of the site. And that is a record of it as it is, because it's based on photography. And that is detailed enough to record all of the individual chocolate blocks. It's scaled perfectly to within a centimetre of the actual scale of the site. So we can use that not just as an interactive record of the site, but also as an archaeological record of the site. We can see how many chocolate blocks there are in the intertidal area. We can take measurements of the dimensions of the chocolate blocks and their relationship to the concrete hard standing up above the high water mark and that sort of thing. So the record that is created through a drone survey is an important archaeological record as well as being one that is much easier for the average public to appreciate. If you were to show them a taped survey drawing, it isn't quite as easy to understand and interpret as a three-dimensional model is. So really the way in which we can approach sites like embarkation hards and like many other Second World War sites that aren't three-dimensional, like the pillboxes, because they've been demolished and have just left us this concrete floor-level record, is using modern technology to its best advantages. So using LiDAR, GIS and drone surveys to record these sites, because we can't physically, we don't have the time really, or the resources to go into the same level of detail as we can for an individual pillbox if we want to capture the scale of these quite large sites.
Where did your interest start, and then how would you suggest someone who has that interest, how do they get into it, if that makes sense? What is their first steps into the world of concrete nerdery, let's call it?
I recommend anyone getting involved. If you, obviously, given the current situation, if you have these things on your doorstep and you can get to them safely, you know, and within current restrictions, then the best place to start is to, from my perspective anyway, on the way I got involved, was to look at these things in their original context, in the landscape, and start to, you know, question what you're seeing in the landscape. But, you know, obviously starting at the top and starting from the documentary record and working down is obviously a viable solution as well. But yeah, the way I approached it was, you know, starting with the physical, working to the documentary. But, you know, both ways are perfectly fine. Personally, I think though, the way for it to grab your attention is to actually look at the physical remains, you know, because you can, it's getting hands-on history. You're starting to consider the structures as part of a landscape, starting to look at the structures in a different way, and start, you know, you're acting like a landscape detective, drawing together the structure, the physical structure itself into its wider context, which for me was the thing that really grabbed my attention. You know, was trying to, you know, yeah, doing actually using my brain and thinking about these things and starting to answer some kind of basic research questions.
I like landscape detective. We will use that again.
I shall copyright that.
Don't be copywriting that. This is all work. That's ours now.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot.
Okay, and then on to Steve.
Well, I guess my advice for anyone who is thinking about getting into researching concrete is don't, because it becomes all consuming and it takes over your life, and eventually your bookshelves look like this and your friends never call you because all you talk about is concrete. And I'm very lucky to have such an understanding wife, and I've managed to twist her into my sad realm of concrete study. But equally, you know, somebody else might have just left me by now because it becomes such a time-consuming effort to learn more. But if it is the sort of thing that floats your boat, then I mean, my own route into it was almost accidental. I never set out to become an expert in concrete, but much like Chris, I found that actually there was a real absence of our understanding of some of these sites. And when I first started looking at LEAP, when I first became familiar with LEAP about 10 years ago, very little was known about it. And in fact, the stuff that I've subsequently learned has completely transformed our understanding of it. So it's commonly assumed that the embarkation hard and the Mulberry Harbour construction site were one and the same thing, and that after the Mulberry Harbour sections had been launched, they used the same facility for loading troops for D-Day. And it was actually only when I started studying the site properly in 2014 as part of a small project that I was able to obtain funding for and ran called Solent 70, which was for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, to look at these D-Day sites within the Solent area, that I discovered that the embarkation hadn't been built first in 1942, and the Mulberry site was added on much later, in fact, at the very start of 1944. And it was actually halfway through that project that I discovered Dobinson's work, having finally been able to locate a copy. His were the only records that existed in the National Record of the Historic Environment at the time, and they all just referred to this Dobinson report, which you couldn't get for love nor money at the time. But I eventually managed to trace a copy, and his work is brilliant in that it identifies some of those really useful records. But one of the things that Dobinson never did, and it was in fact one of his recommendations, was that these sites deserve further study. And what really needs work is investigating how they were used for D-Day. And this came as a bit of a surprise to me, because I had discovered, when I discovered LEAP in 2010, thereabouts, nobody really knew exactly who had embarked at LEAP for D-Day. There was two definite units that embarked there. Nobody was really sure who else, and there were lots of figures floating around online or in leaflets or from different sources. And it was actually only when I started looking into it that I realized that nobody has ever investigated who left where for D-Day. And in fact, I thought that was such a fundamental thing that I presumed it must have been done. But like Chris and his discovery with pillboxes, that nobody's ever looked at you know, the design behind the location of the site, that in fact nobody's ever done that, which is a staggering omission from our historical record of the Second World War, I think. And so it's one of the things that I've started to try and correct. And I'm not totally interested just in the archaeology of these sites. I'm more interested, equally interested, in the history of them and how they were used and who used them. And that is important, because going back to the earlier question, how do we research and how do we record these sites? Research is equally important, because when I came to choose LEAP for this podcast, there was one other site I thought of that is better preserved. It has more of the concrete chocolate blocks, all in situ, all in their perfect locations, with the concrete platform at the top in perfect condition, and the approach roads all perfectly neatly. It's not suffering from tidal erosion because it's on the Medway River, and so it's less exposed to strong currents and storm action. But it wasn't used for D-Day, and that is as equal as I am in terms of its archaeological preservation. If it wasn't used for D-Day, it's never going to have the same level of significance as a hard that was used for D-Day. So I went for LEAP, because having researched it thoroughly now, I know exactly which units embarked on which landing craft and on what time, on which day. And that sort of records doesn't exist anywhere else. It hasn't been published properly yet. So that's something that I'm working on, because I think that's fundamental to our understanding of D-Day, who left from where. Because that's not just an important record that impacts the significance of these locations, but it's equally important as a sense of these sites being memorials and senses of memory, because for many people these were the last times that they set foot on land, and these were their places of departure from a safe and secure landscape before they went over to France, which was anything but. And many of these embarkation hards now have memorials attached to them. At Gosport Hardway, there is a memorial. And down in Torquay, there's a memorial. There's one in Plymouth. There's a few others. But at none of these memorials is there a record of who actually departed from that embarkation hard, because nobody's properly researched it. And I think that it's equally important as having a memorial and having a preserved site, is equally important to understand how it was used and who actually used it. So as well as going out and looking at these sites and recording them, it's equally important that we understand them and we research them. And like Chris says, we can't go to Kew at the moment, and we can't even necessarily go and look at our nearest piece of concrete. But if your interest is in military history, then the research is just as vital to the archaeological recording. And that's my passion, and that's why I'm part archaeologist, part historian, because I try and look at both aspects, the site itself and then the history behind it.
Okay, that's a beautiful one to end on. And yeah, similarly, it was nuts.
Really, was it?
Beautiful one to
You knew
end
the
on.
battery would go at that one moment, didn't you?
I'll leave that in.
That's gonna be one dodgy edit.
Amazing.
Okay, so yeah, that's a good one to end on, and I think I will keep that in there. A good one to have, similar to yourself. When I started talking to yourselves, I probably, like a lot of the public, did go off the presumption it's World War II, we know it all. Like the documents must be bang on, everything's known, what are we going to achieve? It was only when I talked to you guys, started doing work on the ground, that you suddenly start to realize, oh, we don't actually know very little about, as you say, the people, and we almost deserve it to those sites to do the work and to respect what came afterwards. So yeah, I think we will finish up on that one. I will make sure to put links to yourselves, your Twitter pages, and obviously Citizen, and Steve's various social media sites as well. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we've made more of a conundrum out of concrete, but I hope you enjoyed it. We didn't come to any valid conclusion. My preference is towards a site that was actually used. Sorry, Chris.
Boo.
I'll take that as a win.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, bye.
Bye.
See you later.